I hate talking to people about jazz, and I hate when my girlfriend tells people that I listen to jazz. And like, obviously, like, if I was like going on dates or whatever, like, I usually tell them I'm into jazz, and then for some reason everyone gets this weird romantic idea that I like listen to jazz, and they like have this dream of listening to jazz with me or something. I don't know if you've experienced the same thing.
I found that in those situations, it like swings one way or the other, where like either it kills a conversation or like people want to talk about it too much. But part of the problem I have is like in like a work environment, for example, where like people are chatting, and after like a while, eventually the topic of music comes up, and it's like, you know, someone's talking to you about something to do with music that you should know about, and then I'm like, well, I can't really answer that because I don't know anything about it. And then I have to explain that without sounding too pretentious, there's like different ways that I can explain it. I can say, well, you know, I don't really listen to that. I, you know, listen to a lot of jazz. That's probably the best way to say it, you know. Or I could go a bit too pretentious and say, well, you know, I only listen to jazz music, mostly instrumental, from before 1955, and I collect records and 78 RPMs and CDs, and I only listen to music that way, and I don't have a Spotify account, and I deny the existence of music that came after 1960, and all that stuff. And that I've learned the hard way is not a good way to keep people engaged in a conversation.
No, it's horrible. And it's worse, I think, when the person does listen to jazz, but they're like, oh, I love Miles Davis.
Exactly.
I love Mingus, Thelonious Monk, and stuff, and like that. And like, that's cool. That's very cool. And you probably know way more about jazz than I do, honestly, because I personally only listened to singers before 1950 and blah, blah, blah. Like, I've had to have the same exact conversation as you do. So I almost became famous, I think, at the last 3 places that I've worked. The famous phrase is, do not talk to me about jazz. All my coworkers say, she likes jazz, but don't talk to her about jazz. She doesn't want to talk about jazz. I just tell them straight up, I do not want to talk about it.
Yeah.
I like jazz a lot, but I don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it. Like, it's a losing situation for me.
I don't think I'm necessarily that extreme, but I probably have in many of those kinds of situations where I've been talking to someone about jazz. The phrase which comes up a lot for me is, yeah, that's great, but... And then after that is like, what I think is greater than whatever that person is talking about. And it's difficult because a lot of the times the people, you know, who enjoy Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and Charles Mingus, who are all some of the greatest jazz musicians who've ever lived, just haven't listened to the kind of music that I listen to, and so it's hard for us to have a critical discussion about it. But, you gotta let them down easy.
It's, like, almost embarrassing, because, like, have you ever heard of just, like, weird 1930s, like... Because some of it is just like, hey, buddy, we're gonna listen to the old beat and groove. about our topic today. Welcome to the show, by the way.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for sticking with us this far.
Yeah, I'm Lily.
I'm Charlie. Great to be here.
And this is
Shellac
our
Attack.
Shellac Attack, our third episode. Oh my god.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, we pretty much have been talking for like 3 hours just about random stuff. But so one of the first artists that I definitely fell in love with when Charlie was showing me a bunch of them, and I originally didn't like her at first. I think I remember adamantly stating that I hated her voice, was Billie Holiday.
Yeah, it didn't last very long, that hatred.
No, it didn't. And I also adamantly hated instrumental music. But I think as you get more and more into jazz, even if you're just into like jazz singers at first, you kind of get curious about like what's going behind the scenes or what musicians these singers are playing with and stuff like that. And the saxophonist, alto saxophonist,
Tenor saxophonist. Well, you can be forgiven for thinking that for reasons we'll get into in a bit.
Okay. Lester Young, I think, was one of the first saxophonists that I think I became aware of because of Billie Holiday. And especially since one of the fun facts I learned about Billie Holiday, I think from Charlie, I think from you.
Yeah.
You just told me this and I just accepted it as truth. Didn't question it. Was that Billie Holiday was favorite musician was Lester Young.
Yeah. And, well, I believe that's the truth. I haven't asked Billie Holiday. She hasn't been around for a while, but
yeah, she doesn't come around much anymore.
Yeah. But her favorite musician was Lester Young, and he played tenor saxophone on many of her recordings in the 1930s, some of her early recordings. Not quite her earliest recordings, but many of her classics that represent a great part of how she sang and what she was about. And it's interesting that you talk about instrumental versus vocal music, because I think, to me, these 1930s Billie Holiday recordings are a good way to introduce someone who likes vocal music to instrumental music, because they're really a blend of the two.
Yeah.
And Lester Young's a big part of that, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of saxophonists, that Lester Young is probably the most, I don't know, if I think of Charlie Parker as like a crunchy cereal and Lester Young is yogurt.
He's very smooth, very relaxed, very cool. And the thing that I was talking about why you might think he's an alto saxophonist is he has this incredible tone, the sound of the way he plays his instrument, regardless of what notes he's playing or what song it is or how fast it is or anything like that. Is the just texture and tone of him playing his instrument is incredibly airy and light.
Yeah.
And has this relaxed feeling to it. And one of the reasons why that's so important is because he really came up with that concept. And the tenor saxophone playing in jazz that came before him was a much harsher sound, often deeper, growlier. And there were many tenor saxophonists. Coleman Hawkins is really the main one who represents that style. And Lester Young's style is completely different. And he created this idea, which was that jazz could be relaxed, cool, laid back, have this very light, airy tone. And that, speaking of Charlie Parker, it's one of the main things that Charlie Parker got from him, is this lightness. So I thought for the first thing we could listen to what's actually one of Lester Young's first recordings, It's called Lady Be Good, and it's from his first session in 1936. It's sometimes been said among jazz critics, and it's meaningless either way, but that his first recording is actually his greatest one, because he takes a full chorus solo on this that's amazing, both in terms of his tone and his sound, but also in terms of the construction. So we can start off with that one. So that was one of Lester Young's first recordings, from the first time we get to hear him on record, from 1936, Lady Be Good. And it's a small group, basically. The records were released as Jones Smith Inc. To hide the fact that they were records by Count Basie, who Lester Young was playing with, but he had just signed to a different record label, and so they released it under the name of the drummer and the trumpet player, Joe Jones, and Carl Taddy Smith as Jones Smith Inc. And but people caught on pretty quickly that that was Lester Young on tenor saxophone, and that they should be listening to him.
Wait a second. So they're like, oh, I have this record deal. No problem. I'm going to... Do they actually like register it as a company, or are they just like...
No, it was just...
We're just going to print this.
It was just what the label said. It said Jones Smith Inc. I think this was on Vocalion. And then the name of the song, Oh Lady Be Good. And there was no other information about it other than the composer of Oh Lady Be Good. I think it's Gershwin. And so Count Basie had just signed with the Decca record label. But he was friends with John Hammond, who was a music producer and sort of impresario, and he was a producer for Vocalion and what we now know as Columbia. And he was trying to get Count Basie to get recorded. And he was trying to sign Count Basie, but Decca got Count Basie first. And so before they actually made any recordings for Decca, but after the contract had been signed, Count Basie agreed to do this small group session with a few musicians from his band for John Hammond and the Vocalion label, on the condition that they didn't put his name on it. So they chose the name of the drummer and the trumpet player because they're some of the most common surnames of anyone in America, Smith and Jones. And so they labeled it as Jones Smith Inc. And the drummer, Joe Jones, liked to point out that it was actually his record date because his name's on the label, even though his boss, Count Basie, is playing the piano. And Lester Young is there on tenor saxophone, and Count Basie was also his boss at the time.
That's so... I don't know. I sometimes think about musicians during that time, and they're some of the most wiliest, like... They while we know like pop stars and stuff now, they're like stuck in this contract and they can't do anything about it. Musicians from that time, there's so many stories where they're just like, yeah, I have this record contract. But what if and then they come up with like this crazy scheme, and nothing usually, I mean, that I've heard of, it always works out.
Yeah. And a lot of, the discovery of those things has happened because jazz enthusiasts are so thorough in their exploration of these things. And it's an interesting thing with jazz musicians, especially because, you listen to those recordings and you listen to Lester Young's tenor saxophone on Lady Be Good, and on the track we'll hear next, which is with Count Basie, and it just has to be the same person because no one else plays like that. And so to anyone who had ears and was paying attention, it was pretty obvious what was going on. And Count Basie's pretty clear on piano, and on some of the other recordings from that date, you hear Jimmy Rushing singing, and he has a very distinctive voice. And so it was pretty clear what was going on to anyone that was paying attention. And I don't know if the Decca label found out about it, but I'm glad it happened because we have some great music because of it.
Right. So this is Lester Young's first ever recording?
It is. So this is his first ever recording in 1936, and he was already pretty old by this point, by young musicians recording for the first time standards. And at this point, he was a member of the Count Basie Orchestra, which is a great big band of the swing era, so basically the 1930s and 1940s. And Count Basie, who was originally from New Jersey, but had moved around from place to place, had ended up in Kansas City, Missouri, / Kansas, a place we're both very familiar with, and your future home, of course. And Count Basie had played in the band of a guy called Benny Moden. And when Benny Moden had died during, I think it was a tonsillectomy, actually, it was just a routine surgery, but unfortunately there was some accident and he died. Count Basie ended up sort of adapting this orchestra into his own orchestra, and Count Basie had sort of always had his eyes on the prize from the beginning, and he created this really fabulous Kansas City style orchestra, and it had a lot of great stuff going for it. And the sort of idea behind Count Basie's orchestra was to have a big band that played with the relaxed feeling of a small band. It didn't rely on lots of noise and lots of sort of, the arrangements were great, but they really accentuated the talents of the soloists and having this sort of groovy, laid-back feeling. And you can hear it a lot in Count Basie's piano playing. And one of the things that Count Basie had the idea for that he executed really well was, at that time, the saxophone section in the big bands was generally 4 musicians, but it would typically be 2 alto saxophones, 1 tenor, and then a baritone, or there might be 2 tenors, but only one of them would solo. And what Count Basie did was he thought, well, why don't we have 2 featured tenor saxophone players? Let's have one who represents one style and one who represents a completely different style. And so one of the saxophonists he got was this guy called Hershel Evans, who was originally from Texas and played a great growling, sort of inspired initially by Coleman Hawkins tenor saxophone, but he had his own identity, and it was very rough and very it was deep, sort of very traditional in terms of the classic school of tenor saxophone identity. And then for the second guy, he got Lester Young, who was the creator of this new identity for the tenor saxophone and a new sound. And the combination of the two is amazing, and he would feature them both. And that was kind of a new thing, which, you know, now many big bands have that, but initially it was kind of a new thing. You usually only had one soloist on each instrument that you would feature.
So they would both have separate solos?
Exactly. So they would both have separate solos, usually on different songs, but there were occasionally a few songs where they'd play separate solos on the same song. It gave the tenor saxophone kind of the center stage in the band. And part of that was because Lester Young was so great.
How did he find Lester Young?
So Lester Young, he was originally from the South. I think he's born in Mississippi. And he played with his family band in his younger years. His father had a family band that played vaudeville mostly, and they toured around the United States. And Lester Young had left that band and played around in sort of local territory bands for many years, and spent a lot of time in, I believe, Minnesota. And then Lester Young had eventually made his way to Kansas City, and in a band called the Blue Devils, which was sort of the core of the group that would become Benny Moden's band, that would then become Count Basie's band. Lester Young was involved in that scene in the early 30s in Kansas City, and Count Basie figured out that Lester Young was the only person who could really fulfill this 2 tenor saxophone vision, because he was so unique and he sounded so little like anyone else. And so they joined forces in Kansas City, and Lester Young stayed with Count Basie when Count Basie moved to New York in 1936, and then in 1937 became really a big hit. And Count Basie became a very popular band and had this recording contract with Decca and then eventually with Columbia. And they had a long residence in New York at a place called the Famous Door. That was notable because it was open in the summer season because it had central air conditioning. And so it used to be that all the clubs would close in the summer because it was too hot, but this place could stay open all summer long. And it was also notable because it had a hookup to the radio networks, and so they would do live broadcasts every week from the Famous Door.
Right. So that's just like a huge plus.
Exactly.
You're the only one with air conditioning. You have a hookup right to the radio.
Exactly. And so Count Basie became very popular in the late 30s, and in some ways, I mean, the Count Basie Orchestra still survives to this day. There's sort of a legacy Count Basie Orchestra, and he's still a pretty well-known figure of jazz. And he had his own ups and downs, but it all started basically there in the late 30s with Lester Young.
Yeah, we touched on Count Basie in, I think, the last episode.
That's right, yeah.
That we talked about the last of the Blue Devils, I think.
That's right,
that
yeah.
documentary. And so Lester Young and Count Basie were a part of that. And we talked about Count Basie as being probably the biggest big band leader at the time. So you're saying only after they came to New York and were on the radio, was that his big climb to success?
It relates to something that's really a side topic, but the way that music was consumed in the 1920s and 1930s, or even before that, is but especially in that period when there was recording and radio was coming in as a new technology, but both of those were still young technologies, and there was basically a separation between the nationally known bands and, you know, someone like Duke Ellington or Paul Whiteman or Fletcher Henderson, and the territory bands, which were basically a band that would be as popular as any of those names I just mentioned in a specific region of the country, but outside of that region would be completely unknown. And so Count Basie's orchestra and the Blue Devils, for example, the precursor to the Count Basie's orchestra, or the precursor to Benny Moten's orchestra, started out as a territory band, which means they were very popular around Kansas City, around the Southwest, Oklahoma, places like that. And they would tour there, and they were huge, but wouldn't really be known nationally. And Benny Moten's orchestra had a brief spout of national fame, but it was after it was particularly well known in Kansas City and around there. And Count Basie did the same thing, where at first his band was a territory band, and then eventually he made it big by bringing it to the national scene, by bringing it to New York, basically.
Okay.
And so that's part of the reason why the music scene was so important in Kansas City, was because Kansas City was a center for music in that region, in that territory, and it represented the center of Southwestern music. And so we talked about the Blue Devils and also Jay McShann's band, which Charlie Parker was in. That was initially a territory band as well, and then they also kind of made it big later on.
Right. So Count Basie had Lester Young, and Jay McShann had Charlie Parker.
Exactly. And so there's kind of a parallel construction of them both leaving Kansas City to go to New York to become big-time big bands, and with these star soloists who were introduced to everyone through that. Right.
So around this time, does Lester Young gain more notoriety?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely through the Count Basie connection that Lester Young gains some fame. Initially, in this period, Lester Young is really actually not that famous from a popular music standpoint. He was not really a superstar. It was more that the Count Basie Orchestra was very notable, and so people who were paying attention to that would, if you listen to Count Basie, you would basically know Lester Young because he was one of these two tenor saxophonists, and he was, if anything, as great as Hershel Evans was, Lester Young was more noticeable because he was the new sound. And so for the next song, I thought we'd listen to some Count Basie. And tragically, Hershel Evans died very young. He had a heart condition, and so he was replaced with another great tenor saxophonist, Buddy Tate, who was very similar to Hershel Evans. But the reason why I want to play this track, Taxi War Dance from 1939, is because it has a lot of Lester Young solos, but also you hear in between the first Lester Young solo and the last Lester Young solo some Buddy Tate solos. And so if you're listening out for the tenor saxophone, you can hear the contrast between the two sounds. And the main soloist is Lester Young, and listen for that airy, relaxed, cool sound. So what we just heard was a song called Taxi War Dance. And it's sort of a classic Count Basie item from 1939. And it's really great because you hear so much Lester Young on it. And also because you get to hear the contrast between Lester Young and, in this case, Buddy Tate, the other tenor saxophone player who's featured after Hershel Evans died. And so Lester Young takes the first solos at the beginning of the record, and then near the end, there's a few passages with Buddy Tate, and then Lester Young comes back at the very end. And it's how you would have known Lester Young when Count Basie became famous. This is basically the way you would hear him if you went to hear Count Basie at the Fame store, or tuned into the radio broadcasts, or bought the recordings that were on Decca and then Columbia. And that you could have known about Lester Young. You know, he's occasionally announced on the broadcasts, and he gets some name credit on some of the records, but he was not the big name. The big name was still Count Basie at this time.
So it's interesting that, because usually leaders of the band, they are the main star, because they usually do the singing and they do the piano playing, and they're kind of like the showman.
Exactly.
And so Lester Young, I think, was probably the most notable instrumentalist of the band.
Yeah, I would absolutely say that. And so people who are really, paying attention to, the enthusiasts, the jazz and music enthusiasts, they all knew that Lester Young was, of all the great talent in this band, and there was lots of great talent, he was the actual reason to listen to it, and he was the key to the whole thing. But at the time, the audience for this kind of music was much broader than the kind of audience we now represent of intense music enthusiasts. And, this was really the pop music of the day. It was the stuff that was on the radio. It was the stuff that people danced to. It was, if you went to the local record store, this is what was available to buy. And so there was a huge audience that liked Count Basie because it was a great band. But they didn't necessarily pick up on the fact that they'd had this great guy, Lester Young, in it.
Yeah, so let's just put ourselves there. It's 1940, and there is 70% of the population is listening to Count Basie, Orchestra. You're going to the dance hall with your gal, but you have to say, "Oh, I was thinking about staying home and listening to this record tonight because Lester Young just let out a new solo, and while he's so, this band is a little overrated, but this one..." I'm just imagining the hipster at the time.
Exactly. And there were plenty of them. And one of the funny things about that is that Lester Young is, in terms of his personality, was in many ways the original hipster. He came up with the idea of being cool, and many people say that he's the first person to use the word cool to mean what we mean when we say cool today. The sort of laid back,
that's insane.
indifferent, cool, relaxed, confident attitude. And he always wore this signature hat. It was a pork pie hat, and he would always use all this slang, and he would call people by various names, and it was hard to understand what he meant sometimes because he was so he would use these strange expressions that he made up, and he would always play his tenor saxophone tilted off to one side with his head tilted the other way, so it's very easy to notice him in a band. And he really was one of the first people to sort of come up with this sort of idea of almost like a counterculture, but sort of being a bit different from everyone else in a confident and relaxed way.
Yeah. So let me just describe to people, because I might pull up. Maybe I do. I pulled up the article that I found. So you have to imagine, we have like the hipsters of today, the fringe. I would say nowadays, like we have, so much more subcultures. Like we have alt people, emo, goths, general like hipsters. And so the hep cats, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Jazz music was genuinely like really popular, but I think the people who were super into jazz music, they were a little bit more on the fringe, right?
And it was still a subculture. There were the real music enthusiasts and the people who were obsessed with it and who listened to it very differently than the people who would go out and dance to it.
Yeah, so Lester Young was definitely like a star in this category because I do a lot of like photo stuff and whatever for this project, and I was looking at referenced photos for Lester Young, as a cover of one of our episodes, and I came across this wonderful, wonderful article that I just have to share with everybody. Part of it is how to make a pork pie hat. And pork pie hats sounds probably really lame. Like, it sounds like, I don't know. Everyone wore a hat, though, at this time. Like, it was part of, like, the common dress. If you were going out, you would wear a hat.
Exactly, and you would have a different hat
kind of
for different
weird
days of the week and different purposes.
And so Lester Young's signature hat, which is, I think he is credited as like the originator of this hat style.
And it's now still made slightly differently to the way he had it, but it's still used as a hat style today.
Yeah, so I'm probably gonna put this in like the show notes, but you basically take a regular hat. Okay, you take a hat, but you have to get a hat from you would have to go to like a colored or black neighborhood, because apparently that's the only neighborhood you could find untreated hats where like they're not pre-folded. So you get this like standard hat, right? No fold on the brim, no fold anywhere, right? It's this dorky looking shape.
Yeah.
And then so he would take the hats, he would fold the top of the hat, the part that's, placed on your head, not the brim. He would fold it like halfway, if not like more, and would dip it in and dip it down. And then he would like pop up the middle.
Yeah. So it had like a flat like top, this, basically.
Right. It would be this flat, slightly curved top with like a ridge around it. Extremely flat, so it looks like something like a child would draw on somebody. Like, this is a hat. But it was like this cool way to wear your hat.
Yeah.
And I also want to talk about his cap. Lester Young just seems like the person who just doesn't care about anything.
It's like
and
a
is
good
like definitely
representation
his own
of
person.
his sort of stranger personality.
Oh my god. Sorry. I got too excited. So yeah, I'm just going to read this caption. Pet cat Macaroni is fondled by Young. He carries cat with him on tours and all over country, and frequently takes the animal to bed with him. Young decorates cat's neck with multicolored silk bands, which he makes himself. For some reason, if I feel like reading it today, it sounds like he's a pervert. He's fondling his cat. He's going to bed with his cat.
The picture, it's a very cute, very small cat, and it's almost at odds with this sort of tough guy jazz musician image that we often associate with.
Yeah, he definitely feels like a kindred spirit of like today's person and someone of today's like counterculture, because he wears he wears what he wants. He has a cat named Macaroni, which he takes everywhere with him. So while he's like this super talented musician, it seems like there's a lot of just humanity to this person and character.
And I think it's also understanding his importance in sort of the long term. You know, the music is really the most important thing, but when you think about the people like Charlie Parker who idolized him, and they would later on be something of a sort of counterculture group themselves, and the separation of jazz from the mainstream in some ways, he's almost the beginning of it, because he's this guy who he's not a very traditional pop star, and he's not a very traditional human being or musician or anything, and this idea of daring to be different in everything you do is really one of the lasting things about him.
Yeah, especially being people like in the semi like public eye. I think at the time, for the general like, I think someone's parent would be like, "Why are you wearing your hat like that? Is it because of that Lester Young guy?" But it's true. Everyone, after he started wearing his hat like that, everyone started wearing his hat like that. And I think he was one of the people, and they talk about Dizzy Gillespie, I think, in this article too, to just reference the colorful wardrobes that people would have. Like Dizzy Gillespie would wear like leopard print something, and people would be like, "Oh, that's weird. That's cool." So people in jazz were definitely like starting trends.
Exactly. So I wanted to go back and talk about Billie Holiday for a bit, because
oh, don't let me stop you.
I know you hate Billie Holiday so much. You can't stand her voice. You're an Ella Fitzgerald girl through and through.
Oh my God, I'll kill you.
That's a joke.
I know.
But it's hard to talk about Lester Young without talking about Billie Holiday, because Billie Holiday was, he was Billie Holiday's favorite musicians, and I believe it went both ways, and they had a very close musical relationship for a while. And part of that was because one of the things that I guess people aren't aware of nowadays is that Billie Holiday was part of the Count Basie Orchestra for about a year. And so she sang as the big band singer with Count Basie, and unfortunately she's not on any of the Count Basie records because she was signed to yet another different label. But they played together nightly and for months, and during that time, when Billie Holiday got to make her records under her own name and sometimes under Teddy Wilson's name, she often used Lester Young as one of the accompanists, one of the instrumentalists on her records. And these are great recordings because they represent in many ways the beginning of jazz vocals and the integration of a jazz singer into a jazz group. And for various reasons, which we've talked about before, the jazz singers, or the singers on records with jazz musicians from the 20s and early 30s, often didn't really blend well, and they usually weren't part of the groups, and they were not really jazz singers at all. And Billie Holiday was one of the first times when we actually got a jazz singer singing with jazz musicians. And one of the great things about this is that not only was it great because the singer was great and the instrumentalists were great, but because it made both of them better, and the interaction between the two really heightened the whole thing. Yeah. And Lester Young's really an amazing part of that, and I'd recommend listening to all of the Billie Holiday, Lester Young recordings. But one of the things in particular which is really great about that collaboration is the way Lester Young sometimes had this role playing obligato, which is when you have an instrumental musician playing sort of fills behind a singer. And on the next track we'll hear, which is from 1937, it's called He's Funny That Way. This is one of the greatest examples of that, is Lester Young playing at the same time as Billie Holiday sings. And so listen both to Billie Holiday's vocal, but also to Lester Young's melodies and counter melodies behind her on both of her vocals. So that was Billie Holiday singing with Lester Young on tenor saxophone, among other musicians. The song's called He's Funny That Way, and really shows how in sync Billie Holiday and Lester Young were in their musical identities at the time.
Yeah, I'd say, have you ever tried fruit with cheese?
I have, yes. Like an apple and brie.
Yeah, it's kind of something that lifts up something else. It's very much that sort of way. And I think people would be surprised that jazz vocalists weren't always treated like an instrument, I guess, like wasn't always seen as like fully integrating itself into the music, which I think this is like a really great example of.
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah.
It just goes to show that the voice can really, in these recordings, because it's almost equal space for the instrumentalist and the vocalist, the way that the voice can really be an instrument in its own right, which I think we now sort of accept as a given, but wasn't really. The vocal music was considered to be very different to instrumental music back in the day, and it served a different purpose, and it was held in a different regard. For example, if you were a singer, you couldn't be a member of the American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union. It was only for instrumentalists, and so you didn't have any of the protections that you would have if you were an instrumentalist that the union provided. It's sort of strange now that it's all been flipped the other way, where singers are considered much more important nowadays. But this just shows that the way that the two could blend so well. And one of the things which sort of proves it almost is that a few years after this was made, when Billie Holiday was then singing in Artie Shaw's orchestra, and she was friends with the pianist in that band. And one day they were listening to these records together, and Billie Holiday would hum along, she would sing along to the record as it played, but instead of singing her own part, she would sing Lester Young's part in a duet while her voice on the record would sing her part. And she really loved these records, and I mean, a lot of people did. And it's kind of a shame that, for whatever reason, Billie Holiday kind of stopped making music this way, and she started to make recordings that had more of a full focus on her, with orchestra accompanying her, or just her and a pianist. And that music is also some of the greatest music ever made, but it was just this amazing convergence at this time when Lester Young and Billie Holiday played together.
Right. Do you think Billie Holiday would have been the fruit and Lester Young is the cheese?
I think Lester Young is the cheese because he's creamy.
Yeah, I absolutely
And Billie
agree.
Holiday has a bit of a sharpness to her, like a bit of a sour fruit.
Acidity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and Matt, I feel like history could have been totally different if they kept playing
Exactly.
together.
And for many reasons, it wasn't their fault that they stopped playing together. There were many factors, but it's a shame that we have this music which, I like, well, I hate to share personal opinions about, the quality of some music versus the quality of other music. But I think that these 1937 recordings with Billie Holiday and Lester Young, I think they're one of only maybe 2 or 3 sets of music that I've ever heard in my life that are completely perfect. There's just nothing could ever be improved about them. The songs, the singer, all the musicians backing up, every solo is so inspired, every vocal is so emotional, and I just don't think there'd be any way to make it better. And it's pretty rare to hear anything and think that, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of like seeing a movie and then thinking, there's nothing I would add or take away.
Exactly. And sometimes you don't know how you would add or take away from it, but you know something could be done to make it better. But in this case, you just know with certainty that nothing could be done to make it better.
Yeah, I think after being such like a big time Billie Holiday fan, I do find the tracks with Lester Young, I don't know, there's something just so perfect about them together. Yeah, I have a lot of opinions about it, but I think it's an entirely different episode.
We'll let you guys make your own opinions on that. And so, I mean, one of the interesting things about Lester Young is how he was also kind of developing as a musician, and he was this early Lester Young sound, this super airy, light, relaxed sound is not something he held on to for his entire life. And one of the first things that's really interesting that we get to hear him do that's different is he started experimenting with the clarinet. And it's actually Benny Goodman gave him a clarinet. And Lester Young was for a while talking about leaving Count Basie and going to join Benny Goodman, who was another one of these big band leaders. But notably, Benny Goodman was white, and so it would have been quite a big deal at the time for Lester Young, who was African American, to join Benny Goodman. And then there was some talk about Count Basie just disbanding and them forming with Benny Goodman and Lester Young a small group, and none of it really came to be. But Lester Young wasn't just content to be stuck with Count Basie forever, and there's some amazing moments on records at this time when he plays his clarinet, and he sounds very different from a traditional jazz clarinetist because he's playing it basically for the first time. But he's amazingly good on it, and he has a very soulful sound, which is very impressive considering how difficult of an instrument it is to play for an uninitiated. From talking to musicians, from what I understand, it's much easier to go from knowing the clarinet to playing the saxophone than to go the other way, to start by playing the saxophone and then learn the clarinet.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume sometimes that gives the best results because then you play I assume he's going to play the clarinet in a totally different way.
Exactly. And we should expect no less from someone who played tenor saxophone so differently, but the added element of unfamiliarity is really in evidence. And so the next song we'll hear, which will be track number 4, it's called Way Down Yonder in New Orleans, and this is a small group of the Kansas City 7, who came out of the Count Basie Orchestra. This is the Kansas City 6, and it's basically the bass, drums, and guitar from the Count Basie Orchestra, and a trumpeter, Buck Clayton, Lester Young on tenor saxophone, and a guy called Eddie Durham, who was a trombone player and an arranger for Count Basie, but he was also the first electric guitarist. And this session is basically, in many ways, the first electric guitar recording session ever. And so he's playing electric guitar, and there's also an acoustic guitar, rhythm guitar. But Lester Young played some clarinet on this, and this song, he doesn't solo on clarinet, but you'll hear him play clarinet at the beginning and at the end. And it's great to hear him blend in with this very relaxed group that sort of represents what he was about musically. So that was track number 4, Way Down Yonder in New Orleans by the Kansas City 6. with Lester Young playing both clarinet and tenor saxophone. And the other one of the several notable things about this session is the great electric guitar playing by Eddie Durham in one of the first instances of hearing any electric guitar ever. Eddie Durham is one of the musicians who's credited with inventing the instrument and figuring out how to do it technologically.
Yeah, when you said Eddie Durham, at first you said trombone, because Eddie Durham, for some reason, hit a huge light bulb in my head. I'm like, I know that guy is important for something.
Well,
and then you said trombone, and I was like, oh man, I'm just hanging on to this name.
Yeah,
and then
he was
said electric guitar, and I was like, oh yes, that's it.
And most of what he did in this period was playing trombone. He played trombone in the Count Basie Orchestra in the section, and he didn't really solo on trombone, but that was like his main job, and he did a lot of writing and arranging for Count Basie, and many of the great early Count Basie songs, Eddie Durham creations. And on top of all that, he basically invented this key instrument for, all 20th century music, the electric guitar. And he did a bunch of other stuff. He's an amazing person who maybe we should talk about in an episode sometime.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, maybe we should do an episode on him. Yeah.
But if you've ever heard the Glenn Miller version of In the Mood, he's the person who arranged that for Glenn Miller. So he's, in some ways, one of the most listened to musicians in jazz today through that alone.
Oh my God. Can you imagine going from trombone, just going, wah, 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 like I arrange music. Nobody really knows that, though. I'm just a trombone player to everybody else. And then all of a sudden, you invent the electric guitar, and you're like, could you imagine what that would do to somebody? It would either like boost your ego, you would become some sort of god. I don't know.
Anyway, it's a shame that he never really got the credit for it that he deserved, considering how important the electric guitar was to music from the 50s onwards.
Oh my God, and today?
Even until today.
Oh my God, probably the most popular thing to learn. Electric guitar.
Apart from the computer, it's still the most popular musical instrument in the world, I'd say.
We should do an episode where we just rate every musical instrument.
Talk about opinions that I shouldn't share publicly. I have opinions about that one.
Trombone, number 1.
But speaking of instruments, Lester Young on clarinet, it's great to hear him do that. And one of the sad things is that at one point, a few years after this, or pretty soon after this, actually, Lester Young was playing with Count Basie, and he left the stage during a break or something, and someone stole his clarinet, and he was so mad about it that he basically stopped playing it at that point and didn't pick it up until much later in his career.
If someone just stole my clarinet, I wouldn't take that as a sign, or I was so, you stole my clarinet? You know what? No clarinet for anybody now.
That was pretty much it.
Wow.
So, anyway, it's even rarer than hearing Lester Young and Count Basie and Billie Holiday together as hearing Lester Young play clarinet. And it basically ends pretty soon after this, way down yonder in New Orleans. And one of the sort of important moments in Lester Young's life is that also around this period, around 1939, 1940, I think it was the end of 1939, Lester Young decided to leave Count Basie and go out on his own and try to make it having his own band. And partly this was after Hershel Evans had died and they were good friends. And I think Lester Young was feeling a bit constrained by the big band musician's experience. It's very repetitive. You're playing for 3 hours every night, playing the same repertoire over and over again. And even though he was a star soloist, it was not a very liberating way to play music. And he basically was ahead of the curve in terms of having a small group, and he had this small band with mostly him and a rhythm section and sometimes a trumpet, and he thought that was enough.
Right.
And so he formed this group, and he sort of evolved his playing, and he plays in this period in sort of the most airy, light, relaxed sound that you can hear him in his entire career. And unfortunately, he was a little too ahead of the curve in this, because pretty much all music at that point was big band music. There wasn't really an audience for small band jazz. And so they had some gigs, but it didn't really work out in terms of the money. And unfortunately, there's no recordings of just him and his small group. Some of the recordings we have are him backing up vocalists from this period. And one of them is him playing with a singer called Uname Carlisle. And this song is called Beautiful Eyes. It's not a very good song, and Uname Carlisle is not as much of a jazz singer as Billie Holiday, but Lester Young is playing incredibly on this, and hopefully you can hear a bit of a development in his sound to something, to sort of almost the apex of his of this style. So that was track 5, Beautiful Eyes, with Lester Young, with Uname Carlisle. She's a good singer, but she's not really the jazziest of singers.
Okay, but I liked it. Okay, I admit it. And when I listen to Beautiful Eyes, I'm usually like alone in a room listening to like some lady, some lass going, no, and that's like that is what I'm actually usually doing on a weeknight, is listening to music like this, especially since I am kind of going through a Mildred Bailey period again at home. But I really enjoyed this song, and I thought it was very, I think, indicative of, I could think like a lot of older singers.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's what we think of as a really classic jazz singing style now, sort of maybe a blend between Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, or sitting somewhere in between those two, wasn't really the standard yet, because both Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald were just coming into the kind of popularity where they would have that kind of influence. Right. And so, people couldn't be influenced by them because they had their own singing styles. And Uname Carlisle is great, and she represents sort of almost a bluesier, sort of almost like an R&B like singing style. It's sort of reminiscent of some R&B of the 50s. And I love it too, and she makes a lot of great records, and she's not really served well by the repertoire in this session. There's one song which I didn't select called Blitzkrieg Baby, which is a weird song with all these strange statements about the Blitzkrieg and how this lady is seducing a man. Anyway, it's weird.
Are you okay, Charlie?
But Lester Young is great on it, and Uname Carlisle sings it well. And this is one of the few chances we get to hear what Lester Young's small band could have sounded like in the period, because it's his band backing up Uname Carlisle. And his solo on Beautiful Eyes, that song we just played, is it's amazing. It's so light, it's so relaxed, it's and it's in many ways, if thinking about the way Lester Young was influential in his music for later jazz musicians, there are many musicians of especially the 50s who really zeroed in on this kind of style. People like Lee Konitz, who just died very recently, and Lenny Tristano thought that this was the most important time to listen to Lester Young. And these musicians who would, sometimes they've been called cool school, at the very relaxed sort of West Coast jazz feel. It's a distinctive sound, and a lot of it really comes out of this relaxed Lester Young from the very earliest 1940s, basically 1940, 1941.
Yeah, and it's the exact opposite of the bop
Exactly.
that was starting like at the
Yeah.
time. And I think it's also funny because we talked about Miles
Mm.
Davis, and you keep talking about the cool jazz, you know. Uh, it's interesting seeing Lester Young definitely like ahead of the curve and doing more of a. I feel like Lester Young is very timeless, like in his sort of
Yeah.
playing.
And he's timeless in that he's one of those musicians, a little bit like Charlie Parker, really, who like bridges the gap between many different styles of playing. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
people with different tastes based on different rhythmic sensibilities can all appreciate how great he is, and it's just so
Yeah,
enjoyable to listen to. Um,
yeah. He's the cheese
he
of
is
jazz.
the greatest cheese of the cheese board of jazz. Um, Sadly, this small group thing really didn't work out for Lester Young, and he couldn't keep it afloat, and so he actually went back with Count Basie in 1943, and
Man, going back to the old
exactly the
the whole ball and
exactly, and
chain.
Count Basie and Lester Young had a good relationship, but I think um, it wasn't necessarily great for Lester Young to have to go back to that old
Right.
job and have to go back to doing something he tried to leave behind. Um, and more musically, um, Lester Young's style starts changing again, and it starts evolving some more into something pretty different, actually. Um, and well, see if you can spot the difference in this next track, which is from 1943, right after Lester Young had joined Count Basie again. But he started to make these small group sessions for many of the small independent labels that started appearing at this time. And this is actually, if anything, when Lester Young starts to become popular under his own name, funnily enough. And this next song was kind of a hit for Lester Young. Um, and listen both to Lester Young's solo, but also at the end of the track, there's a coda that's played by Lester Young. And this melody sort of caught on and was kind of a famous thing that people associated with him for the rest of his life. This is from 1943, Sometimes I'm Happy. So that was track number 6, Sometimes I'm Happy. That was recorded in 1943. And Lester Young was back with Count Basie and his orchestra at this point, but this is a small group that was recording for one of the small independent labels. This one was on Keynote that came up in this period, and a lot of these small independent labels had much more of a focus on sort of purer jazz and small group jazz. Partly it's because they couldn't afford to hire the big bands, but also they was sort of representative of a start of a growth of interest in really the solo talent in jazz and having them play in their own format. And Charlie Parker, for example, really starts to record under his own name and Dizzy Gillespie's name with these small independent labels that popped up all over the place at the time. So that was Sometimes I'm Happy, which was one of the more popular Lester Young recordings at the time. And really, for the first time in the music we've heard today, and pretty much it wasn't quite the first time, but it was one of the very early times when you actually could buy a record that was under Lester Young's name, and his name would be on it, and it would be clear that it was him playing, and he was the leader.
Yeah.
Finally, a true Lester Young recording. Unfortunately, there's another sort of sad period in Lester Young's life around this point where during the Second World War, Lester Young, who was already pretty old at this point, we was just at the end of the sort of cutoff period when you could be drafted into the army. And in 1944, I believe, Lester Young was drafted, and along with a couple of other musicians from the Count Basie Orchestra. And at the time, there were some opportunities for musicians to have sort of musicians' role in the
Right.
in the armed forces, but unfortunately, that opportunity was less available to African Americans than it was to the white musicians. And so he was drafted and basically sent to training as if he was going to go fight. And he was not in any physical state to be fighting in the war. And unfortunately, he was found to have drugs and alcohol in his possession during an inspection. It was marijuana, I believe. And he was court-martialed, and basically he was sent to the detention barracks for a year. And this was it was a pretty rough time. I mean, it was, military jail, basically. And eventually he was released, and he was dishonorably discharged. And, there's really no reason why he should have been drafted in the first place. And I think,
Absolutely.
and I think that was actually his lawyer, the military lawyer, that was his argument, was basically, the military had no business trying to induct this man into the armed forces, especially as a, active fighter.
How old was he at this point?
So he was, can't remember.
If you could get those numbers
let me run
quick.
the numbers on
Thank
that
you.
one. He was born in 1909. So he would have been in his mid-30s at this point.
Yeah, that would be
Exactly,
insane.
yeah.
Imagine you're 30 years old.
Yeah, I think
You're 30 years old and you get drafted.
I think he was
Oh my
34,
God.
and the cutoff was 35. So the cutoff for when you could be drafted.
And also just think about, he's basically like similar to the time being like a rock star.
Basically, yeah.
Imagine if like, I don't know, who's a rock star? Gene Simmons, while he's at the height of Kiss, has to go. And you can imagine him in full makeup still. Whatever works for you.
And if you look at pictures of Lester Young, this was not a buff fighting man. This is not a man who was going to do well fighting in the war.
He has a cat named Macaroni, who he made silk scarves to wear.
So, anyway, it was kind of a tragic period in Lester Young's life and career, and I mean, I guess at least he wasn't sent off to fight, but still, it was, was not a good thing for his mental health as well, because, you're accused of this crime and sent to jail for it and all this stuff.
Right. It's basically it probably took at least 1 or 2 years, or I don't know how long, but you're taken off from the road. A traveling jazz musician, and all of a sudden you have to go into this super regimented thing, and then you get caught or whatever, and then you're just thrown in jail. Like, you might as well just thrown him in jail for like 2 years. And I bet that they weren't kind to jazz musicians, because a lot of people looked down on them.
And also he was caught with drugs, and people's the public approach to drug use was very different back in the day than it is today. And he wasn't actually a drug addict, but you could get sent to the federal penitentiary for being caught with marijuana. That was the drug of the day.
Right.
And people had a very negative perception of drug use, and so it was overall not good at all. And when Lester Young comes out of he's discharged from the army, and he's really, going back to the music, he's really changed his style a lot. And there's really a very different Lester Young that we hear coming out than we heard going in. And especially very different to how he played in 1941. And his, the sort of style he would have for the rest of his life would be, it'd have a lot less focus on being sort of very lyrical. It's much more based on sort of the rhythmic patterns of his solos, and it has a bit of a rougher tone, and it's also incredible in its own right, but it's quite different to Lester Young from the 1930s and very early 1940s. One of the sort of strange twists of his career is that he actually, at this point, becomes hugely popular and becomes the pop star that he should have been before. And he had some hit records, and he played this concert circuit with Jazz at the Philharmonic. That was a very popular concert production, and he had his own record dates under his own name and his own record contracts, and finally he was playing clubs with a small group the way he was sort of always meant to do it, but it was a slightly different version of Lester Young than what we heard before. So one of the records he made coming out of this experience, which was actually one of his hit records of the day, is a song called the DB Blues, which is said to stand for the Detention Barracks Blues. And so it's this blues, which we'll hear next. This is track number 7 from 1945, and this is one of the recordings which sort of opened up the gates to Lester Young being very popular again. That was the DB Blues, track number 7. It's from 1945, and it's a great little blues by Lester Young, and it's a lot of how you might have heard Lester Young for the rest of his career, basically. Small group with either him and another horn player, and then a piano, bass, and drums. And this is one of the ways in which Lester Young finally became very popular. And partly it's because the appreciation for these small band jazz groups was really growing, and people's interest was moving away from the big bands and towards this kind of music. It's interesting the way Lester Young's style changed a lot in this period, I think. And, I think to offer an opinion, which is, again, unsolicited, I think I prefer the early Lester Young. Some people prefer the late Lester Young, but...
yeah, so if you're listening... That's the pretentious thing to say, probably. And I prefer the earlier Lester Young.
If you want to, be in the...
Or if you want to be counterculture, you prefer the later.
That's the really hip thing to say, is to say, oh, well, actually, I think the later Lester Young is the better Lester Young.
Yeah, this podcast is primarily just so you can talk to people and sound snobby.
Well, the question we're really addressing today is how can you be a hipster like Lester Young?
That is
One is
true.
to have a pork pie hat.
How to be a hep cat.
2 is to have a cat called Macaroni.
A cat named after some sort of food dish.
Hopefully some sort of noodle. And then the third way is to have a preference in the periods of Lester Young.
If you're not getting the hint, this is basically where Charlie's life is going.
Oh, it's not where it's going. It's already where it's at. Wait.
Which noodle would you name your cat after?
Probably Penne.
That's too close to, like, penny.
Yeah.
You gotta do, like, linguine or arrivederci.
Yeah, but the problem is that something like rigatoni, it's too many syllables for a pet name. Cats never respond to that.
Rigatoni's pretty cute.
Rigatoni's a good cat name.
Well, you could call it Tony, or you could call it Riggs. I knew a cat named Riggs.
Riggs is a good cat name. Riggs, short for rigatoni. But anyway, the later Lester Young is also great. There's so much great music. Sadly, it was also accompanied by sort of a health decline, and Lester Young, who would never drink before, sort of developed a drinking problem, which was it was not good, and it had led to, among other unhealthy habits, a decline in his health, and he, strangely enough, died within a year of Billie Holiday in 1959. But after a long period of being very popular and a very successful jazz musician, and having a great record contract with Norman Granz, who Billie Holiday also recorded for in the period, on the Verve label, and being a very popular concert musician and playing at many clubs. It was a eventful life, in some ways very tragic, but certainly unique.
Right. That's kind of just a lame ending, though. Like, and then he drank.
Yeah.
And then he died eventually.
It's a strange one, because it wasn't like, he fell into obscurity and drank himself to death. It was more like, all of a sudden, he was as popular as he ever was.
He was really popular, and life was great.
But he also drank himself to death. I think he was never really a healthy person, but drinking certainly didn't help. And there's, in the last recordings, you can hear sort of a dip in the playing where he isn't playing quite as well as he used to. And that's also kind of sad to listen to, but there's a huge amount of great music before that.
Right.
Yeah, and, when he died, it did have an impact on when Billie Holiday died, it had an impact on the jazz musicians, and I think that at that point there was even more appreciation for the impact of his music. And for example, Charles Mingus wrote a song called "Goodbye Pork Pie Hat" that was a tribute to Lester Young.
That's so sad. Goodbye, pork pie hat. Goodbye, macaroni.
But, Lester Young is really one of the great jazz musicians of all time, and I think one of the things which we touched on, which is really his ability to appeal to people who like all different styles of jazz. And even people who don't like jazz, he's a good gateway drug. He's really just the sound of his tenor saxophone is so likable.
He is, yeah. Way more likable, I think, than Charlie Parker. I'm gonna say that radical.
Wow.
Radical statement.
Wow, now that's a hipster opinion right there.
No, if I had to choose person who says they don't like jazz or whatever, and then they give me my one song that I get to show them, which has happened so many times in my life. They go, I don't like jazz. I say, well, let me change your mind. If I had to choose between saxophonists, which no one really wants, no one really wants me to say, let me show you the saxophonist, right? Usually I have to show something with lyrics, which I think would put me in the corner even more for Lester Young. I think I would show them Lester Young.
And I think I agree with you. I think if I wanted to introduce someone to jazz, I'd probably go for Lester Young before Charlie Parker, because it's such easy listening and also represents like the best of inventiveness and identity, and something that's just nice to listen to.
Yeah, thank you for admitting that.
Yeah, I mean, you were bound to have a right opinion about all this at some point.
If I don't, I'm going to edit it so it looks like I did. Wow. Like, what a cool guy, though. I don't know. I think just even looking at photos of Lester Young just makes me smile.
And
he seems like such a cool guy, and I wish I could have been there near the end of it to be like, what are you doing, Lester? Come on, get your act together.
And I mean, he seemed like the kind of person who just it would have been so interesting to be around him. Like, you would have gotten a lot just from being in his presence. And like,
he's like the first manic pixie dream girl.
Exactly.
He's like, yeah, I'm going to wear my hat like this. And I'm going to... It totally is. Oh my God. Oh my god.
Well,
Wow.
we have one last track for you guys, which we can use as the closing sounds of today. It's track number 8, and it's from 1952, and it's one of the great sessions of Lester Young's later life, and it's him playing with the pianist Oscar Peterson, who is a staple of the Verve label in this period. And the song is called T for Two, and it's Lester Young playing basically as well as he's ever played, and shows him shining bright, and it's a great way to close off this wonderful discussion about Lester Young. So that's our last Lester Young track, T for Two from 1952. That's from the Verve label with Lester Young on tenor saxophone and the Oscar Peterson trio, who were really great, accompanying him. And that's our final Lester Young track. How are you feeling about it?
I feel good. I especially just like the name T for Two.
It's a great song, and has a lot of layers in terms of meaning, and it's also just great music, and I like that one.
It reminds me of just having a cup of tea.
Exactly. And I mean, the song wasn't originally meant to mean that, but back in the day, tea was a slang term for the devil's lettuce, as we might call it today. No
one calls it that. No one calls it that anymore, Charlie.
Well, I still do.
The devil's lettuce. Yeah. Man. He was just a cool guy that wanted to smoke some weed and play jazz.
He was
just a true musician.
Absolutely. He was cool. He was the epitome of cool.
Yeah. He was like the caricature of what you imagine jazz artists to be.
And the best thing about it is how the music matches the caricature. He's really his music is just like such a great expression of his soul, I think. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. I think his music is even more telling of his personality. It's more airy, it's more light, it's more, I don't know, just fun and carefree.
Yeah, I'd agree with
that. And I think initially, seeing him from like afar, you couldn't really get that sort of insight.
And the more you listen, the more it confirms that image, I think. And also the more you read about him and how great of a person he was.
Yeah. Why did you want to talk about Lester Young? Because this is your...
Yeah, I mean...
topic.
It's never a bad time to talk about him. The main reason why I wanted to talk about him was that, we just had this Charlie Parker centennial, and one of the things that gets thrown around in terms of talking about Charlie Parker is that he was influenced by Lester Young. And I think one of the really interesting things is that when you listen to Charlie Parker and you listen to Lester Young, they actually sound very different. And so I always think it's great to go back to Lester Young, both because Lester Young is worth listening to on his own, but also because trying to draw those strands between him and Charlie Parker is, I think, really interesting. And, understanding Lester Young and how he changed this music is sort of an important sort of preamble to the way Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie would change the music a few years later. And it's great to connect those dots, I find.
Yeah.
Instead of just talking about how Lester Young influenced Charlie Parker.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's hard to... I think just knowing like in advance that Lester Young was influential on Charlie Parker, how similar just the beginning of their lives were. Like, because we talked about Lester Young got his start in the Basie Orchestra a lot later, right?
Yeah, it was.
Said that?
I mean, Lester Young with Count Basie is sort of later in Lester Young's life, but it's also a similar story to Charlie Parker, starting with Jay McShann. They're both sort of Kansas City musicians, although Lester Young isn't from Kansas City. And they both sort of appear on the scene in similar ways, and they eventually ended up playing music in similar contexts, and they both signed with Verve or Norman Granz's label, and they both ended up playing in these small groups in the 40s and 50s, and then there's very similar. The styles are pretty different, but there's similar sort of parallels between the two and their popularity. And but I think one of the things that I find really interesting is that then when you actually go back and listen to Charlie Parker's solos, and you go back and listen to Lester Young's solos, Charlie Parker really sounds very little like Lester Young. And we know for a fact that Charlie Parker loved Lester Young, but it's very interesting how little of it he kept in his own style. And also how little of Charlie Parker and bebop Lester Young adopted into his style. He stayed away from that for the rest of his life. And he didn't really evolve into that style.
It's almost like they both admired each other from
exactly.
afar.
And so there's almost some kind of like something like beyond the music that they respected and took from each other that doesn't quite show up when you really listen deeply, but that was undoubtedly there.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to leave.
I think so. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening to Lester Young.